Gaetano Crosetti had worked a demanding night shift at Weirton Steel for 31 consecutive years without missing a single day. But on October 3, 1943, he told his foreman he was leaving early for the first time in his life because his son Dino was singing at the Roxy Theater in Steubenville, Ohio. And what happened in that theater, what a steel worker, still covered in mill dust, watched his boy step into a spotlight, would become the moment that explained everything about who Dean Martin really was underneath the tuxedo and the famous smile. It was Sunday evening, October 3, 1943, and Steubenville, Ohio, was a town built entirely around the rhythm of its steel mills. The blast furnaces along the Ohio River never stopped burning, and the men who worked them moved through life according to shift schedules that didn't care about birthdays, holidays, or anything else that happened outside the mill gates. Gaetano Crosetti had immigrated from Montesilvano, Italy, in 1913, and within 2 years of arriving in America, he had found steady work at the steel plant that would employ him for the rest of his working life. Gaetano was a quiet man, the kind of immigrant father common in that era who expressed love through provision rather than words. He left the house before dawn and returned covered in a fine gray dust that never fully washed out of his clothes, and Dino had grown up understanding that his father's silence wasn't coldness, but simply the exhaustion of a body that gave everything it had to furnaces and rolling mills 6 days a week. Gaetano spoke broken English his entire life, conducting most conversations in the Abruzzese dialect of his hometown, which meant that something fundamental about Gaetano's interior life remained mysterious even to his own children. Dino Crosetti, born in 1917, had grown up in the Italian immigrant neighborhood of Steubenville, known locally as Pleasant Heights, surrounded by other families who had come from the same region of Italy and who maintained their language, their food, and their customs even as their children became increasingly American. Dino dropped out of Steubenville High School in 10th grade, partly out of restlessness and partly because the family needed whatever income a teenage boy could bring home during the lean years of the Depression. By 1943, 26-year-old Dino had spent nearly a decade trying to find his way as a singer, working small clubs throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania under various stage names before settling on Dean Martin. His career had been a series of modest gigs in roadhouses and small nightclubs, performing for crowds that ranged from indifferent to mildly appreciative, never quite breaking through to anything that resembled real success. Gaetano had watched his son's pursuit of music with the particular anxiety of an immigrant father who had sacrificed everything for stability, only to see his son chase something as uncertain as a singing career. The relationship between Gaetano and Dino had grown distant over the years, not through any specific conflict, but through the slow erosion that happens when a father's values and a son's dreams point in different directions. Gaetano believed in steady work, a reliable paycheck, and the dignity of physical labor honestly performed. He had never understood what drove Dino to spend his nights in smoky clubs, singing songs for strangers, when there was perfectly good work available at the mill, work that had fed the family for 3 decades and would continue feeding families for decades more. This wasn't simple stubbornness on Gaetano's part, but rather the worldview of a man who had survived by trusting in tangible, measurable things. A shift produced a wage produced food on the table and a roof that didn't leak. Singing produced nothing Gaetano could weigh or count, and a man who had crossed an ocean with almost nothing had learned to distrust anything that couldn't be measured in those practical terms. Dino's nightclub income was unpredictable, sometimes generous and sometimes nearly non-existent, and this volatility represented everything Gaetano had spent his adult life trying to escape. Maria Crosetti, Dino's mother, had always served as the emotional bridge between father and son, translating not just language, but feeling, explaining to Gaetano in private moments why Dino needed to sing the way other men needed to work with their hands, and explaining to Dino in equally private moments why his father's silence contained more love than Dino could easily perceive. But even Maria's diplomatic efforts had limits, and the gap between the two men had widened steadily through Dino's 20s. In the autumn of 1943, Dino received word that the Roxy Theater in downtown Steubenville was hosting a special homecoming show featuring local talent who had left to pursue careers elsewhere, returning to perform for their hometown audience. The show was being organized partly to boost morale during the difficult years of World War II, when so many young men from Steubenville were serving overseas, and partly a straightforward entertainment for a community starved for diversion from the constant anxiety of wartime news. Dino had been performing regularly in Columbus and Cleveland by this point, gradually building a small reputation that occasionally got him better bookings, though nothing approaching real fame. The invitation to perform at the Roxy represented something different from his usual gigs. This would be performing for the people who had known him since childhood, the neighbors and former classmates and family friends who remembered Dino Crosetti before he became anyone trying to be Dean Martin. When Dino mentioned the upcoming show to his mother, Maria immediately understood its significance and began working on convincing Gaetano to attend. This was no small task. Gaetano rarely left the house except for work and church, and the idea of sitting in a theater watching his son perform represented an enormous departure from his established patterns. Moreover, Gaetano had never actually seen Dino perform professionally before, not once in nearly a decade of his son's singing career. Maria's argument to her husband was carefully constructed around duty rather than desire, understanding that Gaetano responded more readily to obligation than to emotional appeals. She told him that all the neighborhood families would be there, that it would reflect poorly on the Crocetti name if Gaetano was the only father absent from his son's hometown performance, and that people would talk if he didn't show proper support for Dino in front of the whole community. Gaetano resisted for nearly 2 weeks, citing the demands of his work schedule and his general discomfort with public gatherings. But Maria persisted with the patient determination that had characterized their entire marriage, and eventually Gaetano agreed to attend, though he made clear that he could only stay if he left directly after his shift, still in his work clothes, since there would be no time to go home and change before the evening performance. This detail, that Gaetano would arrive at the theater straight from the mill, unwashed and still wearing his work clothes, became a source of significant anxiety for Maria, who worried about her husband feeling out of place or embarrassed among the more formally dressed theater crowd. But Gaetano was firm. He would come exactly as he was, covered in the gray dust of his labor, or he would not come at all. There was something almost defiant in this insistence, as if Gaetano needed to attend on his own terms, or not attend at all. The night of October 3rd arrived with unusual tension in the Crocetti household. Dino had traveled back to Steubenville 2 days earlier to prepare for the show, staying in his childhood bedroom for the first time in years, sleeping under the same roof as his parents, while nervously running through his planned songs in his head. He had chosen a set list designed to showcase his vocal range while still feeling accessible to a hometown crowd that remembered him more as a neighborhood kid than as an aspiring professional entertainer. The Roxy Theater filled steadily as evening approached, with families arriving in their best clothes, having treated the homecoming show as an occasion worth dressing up for. The theater itself was a modest but handsome building, the kind of venue that anchored entertainment in small industrial cities throughout America, with red velvet seats and a stage just large enough to accommodate the various acts scheduled for the evening's program. Gaetano arrived precisely as he had promised, straight from his shift, his work clothes still carrying the particular smell of hot metal and machine oil that had become so familiar to his family that they barely noticed it anymore. He found a seat near the back of the theater, partly out of habit and partly because he felt conspicuous among the more formally dressed crowd. His gray-dusted jacket and work boots marking him visibly as a man who had come directly from physical labor. Several other mill workers in the audience that evening recognized Gaetano and understood immediately what his presence meant. Word passed quietly through nearby rows that Crocetti had come straight from his shift to see his boy sing, and this small detail generated a kind of unspoken respect among the working men in attendance, who understood exactly what it cost a tired body to choose a theater seat over the simple comfort of home after a full shift at the mill. The first several acts of the evening passed without particular note. Local talents performing reasonably competent versions of popular songs, comedy routines, and a magic act that drew polite applause from the audience. Gaetano sat through these performances with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to enduring discomfort, his hands resting on his knees, occasionally glancing toward the stage door where he knew his son was waiting. When the master of ceremonies finally announced Dean Martin, the response from the audience carried a particular warmth that distinguished it from the polite applause given to previous performers. This was Steubenville's own son, the neighborhood boy who had left to chase something uncertain and was now returning, if not yet famous, at least determined and visibly improved from whatever rough beginnings people remembered. Dino walked onto the Roxy stage, wearing a borrowed suit that fit reasonably well, his hair carefully arranged, carrying himself with a confidence that masked the considerable nervousness he felt at performing in front of an audience that included his own father for the first time. He had performed for thousands of strangers across small clubs throughout Ohio, but none of those performances had carried the particular weight of this one. The band began the introduction to his first number, a romantic ballad that Dino had selected specifically because it allowed him to demonstrate genuine vocal control, rather than relying on the more boisterous, crowd-pleasing material that filled out his typical nightclub sets. As he began singing, something happened that surprised even Dino himself. Rather than performing for the anonymous crowd, he found his attention drawn repeatedly toward the back rows, searching for his father's face among the audience. Gaetano sat motionless as his son's voice filled the theater, a voice that carried warmth and control that Gaetano had genuinely never heard before. Not in the kitchen, not at family gatherings, not anywhere in the quiet domestic life they shared. Whatever private doubts Gaetano had harbored about his son's musical pursuits began dissolving in real time as he listened to Dino command the room with apparent ease, his voice rich and assured in ways that contradicted everything Gaetano had assumed about a singing career being little more than indulgent foolishness. The audience response grew warmer with each subsequent song, the applause becoming increasingly enthusiastic as Dino settled into a natural rapport with the crowd, mixing genuine vocal skill with the easy charm that would eventually become his professional trademark. People who had known Dino Crocetti as an unremarkable neighborhood kid found themselves witnessing something unexpected, a genuine talent that had been quietly developing during all those years of small club performances that Gaetano had dismissed as wasted time. It was during the fourth song of the set, a tender number about distant love that resonated particularly strongly given the wartime separation experienced by so many families in the audience, that something shifted in Gaetano's composed exterior. Several witnesses later recalled noticing the steelworker in the back row reaching up to wipe his face, an action so uncharacteristic of the stoic man that neighbors seated nearby exchanged surprised glances. The song itself was unremarkable in the broader catalog of wartime ballads, one of dozens of similar tunes about loved ones separated by distance and uncertainty that filled the airwaves during those anxious years. But something in the particular combination of his son's voice, the crowded theater filled with neighbors he had known for decades, and the accumulated weight of years spent doubting whether his son's choices made any sense at all, broke through Gaetano's carefully maintained composure in a way that surprised him as much as it surprised everyone seated nearby. Dino, searching the crowd as he sang, caught sight of his father's gesture from the stage. The recognition of what he was witnessing, his reserved, hard-working father crying during his performance, nearly broke Dino's composure entirely. He had to look away from his father's section of the theater to maintain his vocal control, finishing the song while fighting his own emotional response to what he had just seen. For a young performer who had spent years wondering whether his father considered his career choice an embarrassment, this single moment of visible emotion meant more than any review or any paycheck could have communicated. Dino later told friends that he nearly stopped singing entirely in that moment, so overwhelmed was he by the sight of his father's tears, and that finishing the song required every ounce of professional discipline he had developed during his years performing in front of indifferent nightclub crowds. When Dino finished his set, the Roxy audience rose into a standing ovation that exceeded anything given to other performers that evening. The applause continued well beyond the usual courtesy duration, audience members calling for an encore with genuine enthusiasm rather than the polite insistence that often accompanies hometown performances. Dino returned to perform one additional song, his confidence now fully restored by the audience's evident appreciation. After the show concluded, Dino made his way backstage briefly before emerging into the lobby where audience members were filtering out, many stopping to offer congratulations and express their surprise at how genuinely talented their former neighbor had become. Dino searched the departing crowd for his father, eventually finding Gaetano waiting near the theater's side entrance, away from the main flow of departing patrons. The conversation between father and son that followed was conducted, as most significant exchanges in the Crocetti family were conducted, more through gesture and presence than extended words. Gaetano, still in his work clothes, the gray dust now mixed with the evening's emotion, reached out and embraced his son in a manner that Dino could not recall experiencing since early childhood. "Non sapevo," Gaetano said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely displayed in front of anyone, even his own family. Those 3 words carried enormous weight within the context of their relationship. Gaetano was not simply commenting on the quality of the performance. He was acknowledging years of misunderstanding, years of dismissing his son's ambitions as foolish indulgence, years of silent disapproval that had created distance between them. The performance had revealed something to Gaetano that no amount of conversation had previously communicated, that his son possessed genuine talent, that the singing wasn't merely indulgent escapism, but a real and substantial gift. Dino, overwhelmed by this rare display of paternal emotion, found himself unable to respond with words either. The 2 men stood together near the theater entrance, both having shed tears that evening for reasons that extended far beyond a simple musical performance, both recognizing that something had shifted permanently in their understanding of each other. Walking home together that night through the quiet streets of Steubenville, father and son discussed the performance in fragments, Gaetano asking simple questions about how Dino had learned certain songs, expressing genuine curiosity about an aspect of his son's life he had previously kept at emotional distance. The conversation lacked sophistication or extended depth, constrained as it was by Gaetano's limited English and characteristic reticence, but it represented a genuine opening between 2 men who had operated for years on parallel but disconnected tracks. Neither man fully understood, in that moment, how significant this short walk home would become in the story they would each carry for the rest of their lives. The following morning, Gaetano returned to his usual shift at Wept and Steel, resuming the same demanding physical labor that had structured his entire adult life. Nothing about his daily routine changed in any practical sense, but something had shifted internally that would manifest in small but meaningful ways over the subsequent years. Gaetano began asking about Dino's career developments with genuine interest rather than polite obligation, began defending his son's choices to skeptical neighbors who questioned the wisdom of pursuing entertainment over steady factory work, began, in his own quiet way, becoming Dino's advocate rather than his reluctant supporter. Dean Martin's career would continue its gradual, steady ascent over the following several years, eventually leading to the legendary partnership with Jerry Lewis that would launch him toward genuine stardom, then to a celebrated solo career that established him among the most beloved entertainers of his entire generation. But Dean often spoke, in later interviews and private conversations with close friends, about that October evening at the Roxy Theater as a pivotal moment that gave him something even success and fame could never quite provide: his own father's genuine understanding and unguarded pride. Gaetano Crocetti lived to see his son achieve truly remarkable and lasting success, watching from a respectful distance as Dean Martin became a household name throughout America, appearing in films, recording hit records, eventually performing in venues that dwarfed the modest Roxy Theater many times over. But those who knew the family well understood that nothing in Dean's later success ever quite matched the significance of that single night when a steelworker, still covered in mill dust, finally understood his son. The Roxy Theater itself closed decades later, eventually demolished as Steubenville's economic fortunes declined, along with the American steel industry that had sustained the town for generations. But residents who remembered that 1943 homecoming show continued sharing the story for decades afterward, passing along the image of Gaetano Crocetti sitting quietly in his work clothes, weeping unashamedly during his son's performance, as a kind of cherished local legend that captured something essential and unforgettable about immigrant fathers, hidden love, and the particular power of finally being truly seen by someone whose approval matters more than any other audience could ever provide. If this story of a father's hidden pride and a son's need to be truly seen moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with anyone who has ever wondered whether a quiet parent's silence meant indifference rather than love. Have you ever discovered, perhaps too gradually or far too late, how deeply a parent actually believed in you all along? Let us know in the comments about the moment your own father or mother finally understood what you were trying to become. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible true stories about the hidden emotional lives of the people who shaped music history.